Marina Rodriguez had always found peace beneath the waves. The 34-year-old marine biologist turned freelance underwater photographer had made a decent living capturing the hidden beauty of ocean floors for magazines and documentary crews. Her small apartment in Monterey, California, was filled with stunning images of coral reefs, shipwrecks, and marine life that most people would never see. But nothing had prepared her for what she would discover on that foggy Tuesday morning in October. The job seemed routine enough. Dr. James Mitchell, a respected oceanographer from the nearby Hopkins Marine Station, had hired Marina to document an unusual rock formation about 12 miles off the coast. The pay was generous, almost suspiciously so, but Marina figured the professor simply had a substantial research grant to work with. She'd worked with academics before, and they often had more money than sense when it came to documentation. Marina's boat, a modest 30-foot vessel named Deep Blue, cut through the morning swells as she navigated toward the coordinates Mitchell had provided. The GPS showed she was heading toward an area she'd never explored before, despite having dived these waters for over a decade. The location was marked on her charts as a restricted zone, but Mitchell had assured her he'd obtained all the necessary permits. As she anchored above the site, Marina noticed something odd. The water had an unusual clarity for this depth, and her sonar readings showed geometric shapes on the ocean floor that didn't match any natural formation she'd ever encountered. The structures appeared to be man-made, arranged in perfect rows like some kind of underwater installation. Marina suited up in her diving gear, double-checking her camera equipment and underwater lights. She'd invested in top-of-the-line recording equipment earlier that year, including a high-definition camera capable of capturing crystal-clear footage even in low-light conditions. The camera was her pride and joy, a German-made device that had cost her nearly 6 months of savings. The descent was peaceful, with schools of fish parting gracefully as she moved deeper into the blue-green depths. At 90 feet, the structures became clearly visible, and Marina's heart began to race. What she saw defied explanation. Massive concrete blocks, each the size of a small building, were arranged in a precise grid pattern across the ocean floor. Some blocks appeared to have been cracked open, revealing dark openings that seemed to lead into underground chambers. Marina began filming immediately, her experienced eye capturing every detail. The concrete looked weathered but solid, with marine growth covering most surfaces. However, certain areas remained strangely clear of any biological accumulation, as if something was preventing life from taking hold. Strange symbols were carved into several blocks, symbols that looked almost military in nature. As she swam closer to investigate one of the open chambers, Marina noticed something that made her blood run cold. Scattered around the structures were what appeared to be metal containers, many of them bearing faded but still visible warning symbols. The universal symbol for radioactive material was clearly visible on several containers, along with other hazard markings she couldn't immediately identify. Marina's training kicked in, and she maintained her distance while continuing to film. Whatever this place was, it wasn't the natural rock formation Mitchell had described. This was something far more serious, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the waves for decades. The realization that she might be documenting evidence of illegal dumping or worse sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the ocean's temperature. Rebecca Thompson had been waiting for this moment for 23 years. As a senior investigative journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, she'd built her career on uncovering stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried. The call from Marina Rodriguez was exactly the kind of tip that made her pulse quicken. A marine photographer claiming to have footage of illegal military dumping wasn't unusual, but something in the woman's voice suggested this was different. Rebecca agreed to meet Marina at a small coffee shop in Carmel, far from the prying eyes of government officials and corporate executives who might be monitoring her usual haunts. When Marina arrived, she looked exactly like what Rebecca had expected: sun-weathered skin, calloused hands, and the kind of nervous energy that came from carrying dangerous knowledge. Marina slid a laptop across the table, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the video file. Rebecca watched in stunned silence as the footage revealed the underwater installation. The concrete structures, the warning symbols, the systematic arrangement of containers. It all pointed to something far more sinister than routine ocean dumping. "I've been diving these waters for 10 years, Marina explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anything like this. The professor who hired me, Mitchell, he knew exactly what was down there. He sent me there on purpose, but I don't think he expected me to record everything." Rebecca's journalistic instincts were screaming. This had all the hallmarks of a major government cover-up, the kind of story that could define a career or destroy it. She'd seen enough classified documents and spoken to enough whistleblowers to recognize the signs of a military operation gone wrong. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Rebecca asked, already mentally calculating the steps needed to verify and protect the evidence. Marina shook her head. "You're the first person I've contacted. I did some research after the dive, and I found some disturbing information about what might have happened in 1983. There were several naval exercises in this area that year, exercises that were classified and never fully explained to the public." Rebecca leaned forward, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. "What kind of exercises?" "The kind where ships carrying experimental weapons suddenly develop mechanical problems and have to make emergency stops," Marina replied. I found records of 3 naval vessels that reported engine failures in that exact location during a 6-month period in 1983. Each time, the ships were carrying classified cargo that was never properly documented. Rebecca felt the familiar thrill of a breaking story. This wasn't just about illegal dumping. This was about a systematic cover-up that had been maintained for decades. The implications were staggering. If the military had been disposing of hazardous materials in violation of international law, and if they'd been covering it up for over 20 years, the story would rock the Pentagon to its foundations. "I need to verify this information," Rebecca said, already planning her next moves. "I'll need to speak to some sources, cross-reference the naval records, and probably bring in some experts to analyze the footage. But Marina, you need to understand something. If this is what I think it is, there are people who will do anything to keep it quiet." Marina nodded grimly. "I figured as much. That's why I came to you. I researched your background and I know you've taken on the government before. I also know you've managed to protect your sources." Rebecca closed the laptop and looked directly at Marina. "I'll need copies of everything, the footage, the coordinates, any correspondence with Mitchell. And I'll need you to stay available but keep quiet about this until I can build a case that will stand up to scrutiny." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca noticed a black sedan parked across the street with 2 men in suits sitting inside. The men appeared to be watching the coffee shop, and when Rebecca pointed them out to Marina, the photographer's face went pale. "They've already found us," Marina whispered, her voice filled with fear. The next morning, Marina's world began to crumble. She woke to find her apartment door slightly ajar, despite being certain she'd locked it the night before. Nothing appeared to be missing, but everything felt wrong. Her photography equipment had been moved. Her computer showed signs of recent use, and several files on her hard drive had been accessed while she slept. The message was clear. They knew what she'd found and they were watching her. Marina immediately called Rebecca, who arrived within an hour accompanied by a gruff-looking man she introduced as Pete Williams, a former Navy intelligence officer turned private investigator. Pete's weathered face and suspicious eyes suggested he'd seen his share of government secrets, and his first words to Marina were both reassuring and terrifying. "They've been inside your place," Pete confirmed after a quick inspection. "Professional job, minimal disturbance, but they've definitely been through your files. The good news is they probably don't know about the backup copies you've hidden. The bad news is they're watching you around the clock now." Rebecca pulled out a secure phone and began making calls to sources she'd cultivated over years of investigative work. Within hours, she'd confirmed that Dr. Mitchell had indeed worked on classified naval projects in the 1980s, and that his current research was being funded by a defense contractor with deep ties to the Pentagon. Mitchell was a setup, Rebecca explained to Marina. He was specifically chosen to lure you to that location. Someone wanted that site documented, but they needed plausible deniability. If you just stumbled across it by accident, they could claim you were trespassing in restricted waters. But if a respected scientist hired you to go there, they could control the narrative. Marina felt sick, so I was used. Worse than that, Pete interjected. You were set up to take the fall. My sources tell me there's already a file being prepared that will paint you as an environmental extremist who fabricated evidence to damage the military's reputation. They've been building a case against you since before you even made that dive. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Marina had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The footage she'd captured wasn't just evidence of environmental crimes. It was proof of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. And now she was marked as a threat to national security. Rebecca outlined their strategy. We need to move fast. I'm going to contact my editor and start preparing the story for publication. Pete is going to help us gather additional evidence and keep you safe. But Marina, you need to disappear for a while. They can't silence you if they can't find you. Marina's hands shook as she realized her life as she knew it was over. The peaceful existence she'd built as a marine photographer was gone, replaced by a nightmare of surveillance, threats, and government conspiracies. But looking at the footage on her laptop, she knew she couldn't back down. Too many people deserved to know the truth about what had been hidden beneath the waves for 23 years. There's something else, Marina said quietly. When I was down there, I saw something else. Something that wasn't just dumped containers. Rebecca and Pete exchanged glances. What kind of something? There were structures that looked like they were built to contain something. Not just storage containers, but actual containment facilities. And some of them had been breached from the inside. The implications hung heavy in the air. If the military had been dumping hazardous materials, that was one thing. But if they'd been conducting experiments that had gotten out of control, the story became exponentially more dangerous. Dr. Amanda Foster had been the Navy's leading expert on underwater containment systems in 1983. Now retired and living quietly in a small coastal town in Oregon, she'd spent the last 20 years trying to forget the project that had nearly destroyed her career and her conscience. When Pete Williams appeared at her door with questions about classified operations, Amanda knew her past had finally caught up with her. "I've been expecting someone like you for years," Amanda said, inviting Pete into her modest home. "I always knew the truth would surface eventually. The ocean has a way of revealing its secrets." Pete wasted no time with pleasantries. We have footage from the installation. We know about the containers, the concrete structures, and the warning symbols. What we need to know is what was really happening down there. Amanda poured herself a cup of tea with shaking hands. Operation Deep Vault. That's what they called it. The official story was that we were testing new underwater storage systems for emergency supplies. The reality was far more sinister. She explained how the project had begun as a legitimate research initiative, but had quickly evolved into something much darker. The military had been experimenting with biological weapons, and they needed a place to dispose of the failures and byproducts. The ocean floor seemed like the perfect solution, remote, deep, and supposedly permanent. The concrete structures were designed to last for centuries, Amanda continued. They contained not just biological agents, but also experimental chemicals that were too dangerous to dispose of through normal channels. The entire operation was classified at the highest levels, with only a handful of people knowing the full scope of what was happening. Pete leaned forward. What went wrong? Amanda's face grew pale. Everything. The containment systems began failing within months of installation. The biological agents were more aggressive than anticipated, and they started breaking down the concrete barriers. By late 1983, we had a full-scale containment breach on our hands. The implications were staggering. If biological weapons had been leaking into the ocean for over 20 years, the environmental impact could be catastrophic. Pete thought about Marina's footage, particularly the areas where marine life seemed to be avoiding certain structures. How was it covered up? Pete asked. Simple. They classified the entire project under national security protocols and made sure everyone involved understood the consequences of speaking out. A few scientists who tried to report the problems were discredited, transferred, or worse. The official records were either destroyed or buried so deep in classified files that they'd never see the light of day. Amanda walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a small metal box. I've been keeping these for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to use them. I couldn't live with the knowledge that we'd poisoned the ocean and then covered it up. Inside the box were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be biological samples in sealed containers. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, showing a systematic pattern of environmental crimes that had been sanctioned at the highest levels of government. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Pete asked. Amanda's eyes filled with tears. Because I was a coward. I was more concerned about my career and my security clearance than I was about the truth. But I never forgot what we did down there, and I never stopped feeling guilty about it. Pete carefully examined the documents, recognizing several names that were now prominent in defense circles. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened in 1983. It was about the ongoing cover-up that had protected careers and reputations for decades. These people are still in positions of power, Pete observed. If this information becomes public, it won't just destroy their reputations. It could bring down entire government agencies. Amanda nodded grimly. That's why they'll kill to keep it secret. And that's why your photographer friend is in mortal danger. Meanwhile, Marina had taken refuge in a small motel outside Sacramento, constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at every unexpected sound. The weight of what she discovered was crushing, but she knew she couldn't give up. Too many people had already died to protect this secret. Rebecca called with an update. We've got corroboration from Dr. Foster, and I've confirmed the identities of several people who were involved in the original operation. The story is solid, but we need to move fast. My editor is getting pressure from upstairs to kill the investigation. Marina felt the walls closing in. What kind of pressure? The kind that comes from very high places. Someone made a call to the publisher, and suddenly everyone's worried about national security and legal liability. We have maybe 48 hours before they find a way to shut us down completely. The race was on. Marina knew that once the story was published, there would be no going back. Her life would never be the same, but at least the truth would be out there. She thought about all the marine life that had been affected by the contamination, all the people who had a right to know what had been dumped in their ocean. As she prepared for what might be her final interview with Rebecca, Marina made a decision that would change everything. She was going to tell the complete truth, regardless of the consequences. The ocean had trusted her with its secrets, and she wasn't going to let it down. The story was about to break, and powerful people were scrambling to contain the damage. But Marina Rodriguez had captured something on her camera that couldn't be buried, covered up, or denied. The truth was finally rising to the surface, and no amount of government pressure could stop it. General Harrison Blake had built his career on keeping secrets. As the Pentagon's Deputy Director of Information Security, he'd successfully buried dozens of embarrassing incidents that could have damaged national security or military reputations. But the call he received from his contact at the San Francisco Chronicle was different. This wasn't about spin control or damage limitation. This was about preventing a catastrophe that could expose decades of illegal activities. The story is going to print tomorrow, his source informed him. Rodriguez has footage that's incredibly damaging, and they've found corroborating witnesses. My publisher is nervous, but the legal team says the evidence is solid enough to proceed. Blake hung up the phone and immediately activated a crisis protocol he'd hoped never to use. Within minutes, he was on a secure line with Admiral Patricia Vance, the officer who'd overseen the original deep vault operation and was now serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. "Pat, we have a problem," Blake said without preamble. "The Rodriguez situation has escalated beyond our control. The journalist has multiple sources, and they're going public within 24 hours." Admiral Vance's voice was ice cold. "What are our options?" "Limited. We've already tried intimidation, surveillance, and pressure on the newspaper. Rodriguez is hidden, the journalist is protected, and they have enough evidence to weather any legal challenges we might mount." The silence on the line stretched for several seconds before Vance spoke again. "Then we move to the final option. Activate the Phoenix Protocol." Blake felt a chill run down his spine. The Phoenix Protocol was a last resort measure that involved completely discrediting the evidence and anyone associated with it. It was brutal, thorough, and had never failed to protect national security interests. It was also completely illegal and morally indefensible. "Pat, are you sure about this? Once we activate Phoenix, there's no going back. People will get hurt." "The alternative is worse," Vance replied. "If this story breaks, it won't just destroy careers. It'll expose operations that are still active, compromise agents who are still in the field, and potentially start a war with environmental groups and foreign governments. We can't let that happen." Blake knew she was right, but the weight of what they were about to do was crushing. He'd spent his entire career serving his country, but somewhere along the way, serving the country had become synonymous with protecting the people who made the decisions rather than the people who lived with the consequences. "I'll need 6 hours to put everything in place," Blake said finally. "You have 4, Vance replied. "And Harrison, make sure it's permanent this time. We can't afford any loose ends." As Blake began making the calls that would destroy Marina Rodriguez's life, he tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing. National security was more important than individual rights, and sometimes protecting the greater good required making difficult choices. But deep down, he knew he was about to cross a line that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Phoenix Protocol was designed to be swift and comprehensive. Within hours, a carefully orchestrated campaign would begin that would paint Marina as an unstable environmental extremist with a history of fabricating evidence. Her financial records would be altered to show payments from radical environmental groups. Her diving certifications would be questioned, and her mental health would be called into doubt. Dr. Mitchell would suddenly discover that his research had been compromised, and that Marina had been hired by unknown parties to create false evidence. The footage would be dismissed as sophisticated computer-generated imagery, and experts would testify that the underwater installation was either a natural formation or a legitimate military training facility. Rebecca's reputation would be destroyed through a series of leaked documents suggesting she'd been involved in previous hoaxes. Her sources would be discredited, her editor would be pressured to fire her, and the story would die a quiet death in the back pages of retraction notices. It was a perfect plan, executed by people who'd perfected the art of making inconvenient truths disappear. But Blake had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the determination of a woman who'd spent her life exploring the hidden depths of the ocean. Marina had been preparing for this moment since her apartment was searched. She'd hidden copies of the evidence in multiple locations, created backup plans for every scenario, and established contact with international media outlets that were beyond the reach of American government pressure. When the Phoenix Protocol activated, Marina was ready. The attack began at dawn. Marina woke to find her motel room surrounded by FBI agents claiming she was wanted for questioning in connection with environmental terrorism. The charges were vague but serious enough to justify detention, and the agents made it clear that cooperation would be in her best interests. Marina had anticipated this moment. She calmly allowed herself to be arrested while activating a predetermined signal that would alert her contacts that the final phase of the cover-up had begun. As she was led away in handcuffs, she felt a strange sense of peace. She'd done everything she could to protect the truth, and now it was out of her hands. Rebecca received the alert while she was putting the finishing touches on her story. The message was simple: Phoenix is active. Execute contingency plan now. Rebecca immediately sent encrypted copies of the story and all supporting evidence to journalists in London, Berlin, and Tokyo. She also uploaded everything to a secure server that would automatically release the information to WikiLeaks and other disclosure sites if she failed to check in within 72 hours. The race was on. Blake's team was working frantically to destroy Marina's credibility and suppress the story, while Rebecca's allies around the world were preparing to publish the truth regardless of American government pressure. Dr. Foster, who'd been monitoring the situation from her home in Oregon, made a decision that would change everything. She drove to the nearest FBI field office and surrendered herself, along with all the evidence she'd been hiding for 20 years. "I want to confess to my role in Operation Deep Vault," she told the stunned agents. "And I want to testify about the cover-up that's been ongoing for 23 years. The Phoenix Protocol was designed to handle individual threats, but it wasn't equipped to deal with multiple simultaneous exposures from credible sources." As Foster's confession hit the media, Blake realized that his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. Admiral Vance was furious. "How did they get ahead of us?" "They were prepared," Blake admitted. Rodriguez anticipated our response and had contingencies in place. The story is already spreading through international media, and we can't control the narrative anymore. The truth was finally breaking through the wall of secrecy that had protected Operation Deep Vault for over 2 decades. Marina Rodriguez, a simple marine photographer who just wanted to document the ocean's beauty, had inadvertently triggered the exposure of one of the military's darkest secrets. But the fight was far from over. Blake and his associates still had cards to play, and they weren't going to give up without a battle that would shake the foundations of American government and journalism. The story broke simultaneously in 12 countries, making it impossible for American authorities to contain the damage. The London Times led with U.S. Navy's secret ocean poisoning, while Der Spiegel's headline read, "Underwater Chernobyl, America's Hidden Environmental Crime." The international pressure was immediate and overwhelming. Marina, still in federal custody, watched the coverage from her cell with a mixture of triumph and terror. She'd succeeded in exposing the truth, but she knew the people responsible would never forgive her for destroying their carefully constructed lies. The charges against her were mounting, everything from trespassing in restricted waters to possessing classified materials. But she also knew that public attention was her best protection. Rebecca's editor, who'd been wavering under government pressure, suddenly found his resolve when the story became an international sensation. The Chronicle's website crashed from traffic as readers around the world demanded access to the original investigation. Phone calls poured in from environmental groups, foreign governments, and competing news organizations, all demanding more information. "We're going to win this," Rebecca told Pete Williams during a hurried meeting in the newspaper's offices. "The story is too big to suppress now, and we have too many credible sources for them to discredit everyone." Pete wasn't as optimistic. Blake and his people are regrouping. They're going to come at us from a different angle now, probably national security claims and accusations of treason. Marina's in serious danger, and they're going to try to paint all of us as enemies of the state. As if on cue, Rebecca's phone rang. The caller identified himself as a representative of the Justice Department, and his message was clear. The Chronicle's continued publication of classified information was a violation of federal law, and everyone involved would be prosecuted to the fullest extent. "We're prepared for that," Rebecca replied calmly. "We've consulted with constitutional lawyers, and we're confident that the public's right to know outweighs any classification concerns, especially when the classified information reveals ongoing environmental crimes." The government's response was swift and predictable. Within hours, federal prosecutors announced that Marina Rodriguez was being charged with espionage, theft of classified materials, and terrorism. The charges were clearly designed to intimidate other potential whistleblowers and justify extreme measures against anyone who supported her. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Environmental groups rallied to Marina's defense, portraying her as a hero who'd risked everything to expose government crimes. International human rights organizations condemned the charges as politically motivated, and several foreign governments offered Marina asylum if she could somehow reach their embassies. Dr. Foster, meanwhile, was providing investigators with a roadmap to 20 years of cover-ups and illegal activities. Her testimony revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond the original Deep Vault operation, implicating dozens of current and former officials in ongoing environmental crimes. The contamination didn't stop in 1983. Foster explained to a Senate subcommittee that had been hastily convened to investigate the allegations. Similar operations continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with different code names but the same basic methodology. We've been systematically poisoning the ocean for decades. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Pentagon and the White House. President Morrison, who'd been briefed on the situation, was reportedly furious that he'd been kept in the dark about operations that could destroy his administration's environmental credentials. Admiral Vance found herself called before a closed-door session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, where she was forced to admit that Deep Vault had been far more extensive than previously acknowledged. The contamination had spread over hundreds of square miles, affecting marine ecosystems and potentially reaching the food chain. The original assessment was that the materials would be safely contained for centuries, Vance testified. We now know that assessment was catastrophically wrong. General Blake, watching his carefully constructed career crumble, made a desperate decision. He would provide evidence that the cover-up had been ordered by people even higher up the chain of command, potentially reaching the previous administration and career politicians who'd been in power for decades. I was following orders, Blake told investigators. The decision to classify Deep Vault and suppress all evidence came from the Secretary of Defense himself, with approval from the White House. I have documentation proving that multiple administrations have been aware of the contamination and chose to cover it up rather than address it. The political implications were staggering. If Blake could prove that the cover-up had bipartisan support across multiple administrations, it would trigger a constitutional crisis that could reshape American government. Marina, still in custody but now represented by a team of civil rights lawyers, watched the proceedings with amazement. Her simple diving expedition had triggered a political earthquake that was exposing decades of government corruption and environmental crime. But she also knew that the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The people responsible for Deep Vault had too much to lose to surrender quietly, and they still had resources and connections that could be used to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. As she prepared for her bail hearing, Marina reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She'd started as a marine photographer who loved the ocean's beauty, and she'd become the key witness in one of the most significant environmental scandals in American history. The truth was finally surfacing, but the battle for justice was just beginning. The bail hearing for Marina Rodriguez became a media circus that attracted international attention. Outside the federal courthouse in San Francisco, protesters held signs reading, "Free the ocean's voice," and "Truth is not treason." Environmental activists, joined by journalists and civil rights advocates, created a human chain around the building to show support for the woman who'd exposed the government's darkest secret. Inside the courtroom, Marina's legal team, led by renowned civil rights attorney David Chen, argued that the charges against their client were politically motivated and that she was a whistleblower protected under federal law. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, countered that Marina had deliberately stolen classified information and compromised national security. Judge Margaret Harrison, a Clinton appointee with a reputation for fairness, listened carefully to both sides before making her decision. While the charges against Ms. Rodriguez are serious, the evidence suggests that she uncovered information about ongoing environmental crimes that the public has a right to know. "I'm granting bail with certain conditions." Marina walked out of the courthouse to thunderous applause from the crowd. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The legal system was working, and public opinion was firmly on her side. Rebecca, who'd been covering the hearing, immediately arranged a press conference where Marina would tell her story in her own words. The event was scheduled for the next morning, giving news organizations around the world time to prepare for what promised to be a historic moment. But Blake and his associates weren't finished. That night, they activated the final phase of their plan, a coordinated attack on Marina's credibility that would be so devastating she'd be forced to recant her testimony to save her reputation. The attack began with leaked documents suggesting that Marina had been involved in environmental extremism during her college years. Photos surfaced showing her at protest rallies, and former classmates were quoted describing her as unstable and obsessed with government conspiracies. Dr. Mitchell, who'd been cooperating with authorities, suddenly changed his story. He now claimed that Marina had approached him with a plan to create false evidence of government dumping, and that he'd only agreed to help because she'd threatened to destroy his career. The fabricated evidence was sophisticated and convincing. Bank records showed payments from radical environmental groups to Marina's accounts. Email exchanges between Marina and fictional extremist contacts were leaked to sympathetic media outlets. Expert witnesses emerged to testify that the underwater footage had been digitally manipulated. The campaign was having its intended effect. Public opinion began to shift as media outlets questioned whether Marina was a heroic whistleblower or a dangerous radical who'd fabricated evidence to support her anti-government agenda. Rebecca worked frantically to debunk the false evidence, but the damage was being done faster than she could respond. Her own reputation was under attack, with leaked documents suggesting she'd been involved in previous hoaxes and that her journalism was motivated by personal animosity toward the military. Marina watched the character assassination with growing despair. She knew the evidence was fabricated, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The people behind the campaign were skilled professionals who'd perfected the art of destroying reputations and burying inconvenient truths. Dr. Foster, who'd been monitoring the situation from protective custody, made a decision that would change everything. She contacted her former colleagues who'd been involved in Deep Vault, people she'd remained in touch with over the years who'd been carrying the same burden of guilt. "It's time," she told them. "We can't let them destroy this woman for telling the truth about something we did. We need to come forward together." Within 24 hours, 7 former military personnel and contractors came forward with statements supporting Marina's testimony. They provided additional evidence of the Deep Vault operation, including photographs, documents, and personal testimonies that corroborated every aspect of Marina's story. The coordinated revelation was devastating to Blake's campaign. It became impossible to maintain that Marina had fabricated evidence when multiple independent sources were confirming the same facts. The underwater installation was real, the contamination was real, and the cover-up was real. Admiral Vance, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond control, made a desperate decision. She would offer to cooperate with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony would provide the final piece of evidence needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. "I'll tell you everything," Vance told federal prosecutors. "But I want guarantees that I won't be prosecuted for following orders that came from the highest levels of government." The offer was accepted, and Vance's testimony provided a detailed roadmap of the Deep Vault operation and its cover-up. She revealed that the contamination had been far worse than previously acknowledged, that similar operations had continued for decades, and that the cover-up had involved officials at the highest levels of government. Blake, abandoned by his superiors and facing inevitable prosecution, made his own deal with investigators. He provided evidence that the cover-up had been ordered by people who were still in positions of power, potentially reaching current members of Congress and the executive branch. The political earthquake that Marina had triggered was about to reshape American government. The simple marine photographer who just wanted to document the ocean's beauty had inadvertently exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. But the most dangerous phase was still ahead. The people responsible for Deep Vault had too much to lose to surrender quietly, and they still had resources that could be used to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Marina's fight for justice was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just her fate, but the fate of environmental protection and government accountability in America. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Operation Deep Vault was just the tip of the iceberg. Congressional hearings revealed a pattern of environmental crimes spanning decades, with multiple administrations participating in cover-ups that protected military contractors and defense officials from accountability. The House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, chaired by Congresswoman Lisa Martinez, subpoenaed documents from the Pentagon, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Security Agency. What they found was a systematic effort to hide environmental contamination from the American people while continuing operations that poisoned the ocean and threatened marine ecosystems. Marina testified before the committee in a hearing that was broadcast live around the world. Wearing a simple blue dress and speaking in a calm, clear voice, she described her discovery of the underwater installation and the subsequent campaign to discredit her testimony. "I'm not a hero," Marina told the committee. "I'm just a photographer who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But I believe the American people have a right to know what's been done to their ocean in their name." Committee members from both parties praised Marina's courage while expressing outrage at the cover-up. Republican Congressman James Wilson, typically a strong supporter of military operations, called the Deep Vault scandal a betrayal of everything our military is supposed to stand for. Democratic Congresswoman Angela Davis was more direct. "This is what happens when we allow secrecy to override accountability. The people responsible for this disaster must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The hearings revealed that the contamination from Deep Vault had spread far beyond the original site. Marine biologists testified that unusually high rates of cancer and genetic abnormalities in fish populations could be traced to the contamination. Oceanographers presented evidence that the toxic materials had entered the food chain and were now present in commercially harvested seafood. Dr. Michael Torres, a marine biologist from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, provided some of the most damning testimony. The contamination from Deep Vault has created a dead zone in the ocean that's expanding every year. We're talking about an environmental disaster that could affect marine ecosystems for generations.